What does this symbol mean? This is the first image we see when we load up the game, but many players won't even realize when they begin that this is the Elden Ring itself. After all, it's not actually a ring. It's the loading symbol in the corner of the screen. It's the cover art. It's inside Marika's body at the end of the game. But after completing the entire game, I still didn't know how to interpret it. Yet, there is a reason that the Elden Ring has this particular shape. And by the end of this video, you will find it impossible to unsee. So, once again, come with me, and let's discuss. It might seem like a fool's errand for me to start with an action-packed game of the year, and end with a video about geometry, of all things. However, Elden Ring has an entire hidden language of shape inside of it, with particular shapes recurring too often to be a coincidence. There's the ring, the spiral, the arc, and others. If we can decipher this language, we will find a treasure trove of connections to make. And yet, no one seems to have cracked the code yet, so let's be the ones to give it an honest try. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to draw from many different examples as I discuss shapes. So if it starts to feel like I'm jerry-rigging an interpretation from disparate parts, keep in mind that the creative process for the game likely worked the other way around. I claimed in my last video that in Elden Ring, the language of creation is shape and motion, and I think the creative team behind the game was working with this concept in mind. So they considered first the intrinsic character of shapes, the story that those individual shapes tell, and then they built a world around those concepts. Before we get to the shapes themselves, however, there are two other fundamental concepts we need to understand.
I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order.
At the height of the Golden Order, Marika launched an inquiry into its nature. It seems that even the god of this world didn't fully understand her own order, and so began Golden Order fundamentalism. Now, the word fundamentalism has a very particular and charged association in our world, but in Elden Ring, the word is meant to express a desire to understand the fundamentals of the Golden Order, and this was an intellectual endeavor, as evidenced by the fact that fundamentalist incantations require intelligence to cast. We know what the end point of this inquiry was because there are two incantations that are labeled as the key fundamentals, namely Law of Regression and Law of Causality. The descriptions of these incantations are extremely confusing, as regression is called the pull of meaning, where causality is said to be the pull between meanings. I think the confusion is intentional, because if you ever tried to read academic theories, they are not famous for being accessible. But let's break down what these spells actually represent. When cast, both spells have you extend and move your arms, almost like the hands of a clock. Whether they are going clockwise or counterclockwise depends on your perspective, but it's still clear that one of the interpretations of these concepts is the forward and backward movement of time. Causality is a chain of cause and effect, the way that one event branches and causes other events as it ripples outward. Regression, on the other hand, is the yearning of things to go back, to reconverge towards the first cause, which is a term in Christian theology to refer to God. This idea that regression turns back time is connected to the spell's effect, which undoes spells and other temporary buffs in the area. However, time is only one axis on which regression and causality act. They are even more fundamental than that. In spatial terms, causality is about the relationship between things, the idea that even as something divides into many parts, each of those pieces is connected to the others, and so they feel the pull between meanings. Meanwhile, regression is the connection that all of the parts share to their source, the shared pull of one greater meaning. I mentioned that the first cause is a Christian term, but causality is an important concept in many religions, and the Japanese term for law of causality uses the word inga, an important Buddhist concept. I don't want to go too far down the religion rabbit hole, because my goal is to talk about these concepts in relation to Elden Ring. But I'll note that the image that keeps popping into my head whenever I think about inga is a Zen stone garden. I couldn't find a source to back me up on the connection within Zen philosophy itself, but when I look at a stone garden, with its ripples weaving between stones, I always think about the way that the stones are related to each other, the fact that each grain of sand or gravel depends upon the placement of everything else in order to find its spot. So, back to Elden Ring lore. We've gotten very abstract, but this relationship between disparate pieces of a greater whole is also very literal in the background of Elden Ring. We learn from Hyetta that all life was once combined into the one great, which divided itself into many pieces to create life. This narrative is also backed up by Ymir in the DLC, who says that all life began with a great rupture in the sky, which sounds like a description of the Big Bang. The descriptions of the Crucible also describe it as a place where all life was once blended together. So we have multiple different perspectives arriving at a similar fundamental truth about the lore of Elden Ring. Everything was once one, until the greater will chose to divide things and create the many disparate creatures of the world. The first cause is the greater will, and the people of the lands between are the many pieces, existing in relation to each other, the pull between meanings, and yet always feeling a yearning for their origin, for a connection to their creator, the pull of one deeper meaning. This is a big idea to unpack in a few minutes, but let it settle and keep it in the back of your head as we continue to talk about geometry, because it will crop up in discussion of our sacred shapes. Okay, time to actually talk about shapes. I'm going to begin with the ring or circle, because it's relatively easy to interpret, and is arguably the most important symbol of the Golden Order. I say that because of the prominence of rings in the fundamentalist incantations. Among the Golden Order fundamentalists were Radagon and Miquella, the Elden Lord and his demigod child, who crafted spells that reflected their understanding of the Golden Order and offered them to each other as gifts. On the one hand, it's utterly adorable to imagine a father and son engaging in a philosophical debate by crafting spells for each other. On the other hand, we know that the end result of this debate was Miquella abandoning the Golden Order entirely, so what he discovered probably wasn't all that lovely. In any case, the circle is in many ways a simple shape. It often is thought to represent completeness or purity, and in Japanese, it is synonymous with something being true. If you were to give someone a true or false quiz in Japanese, they would answer maru for true, which literally means round, and is represented by drawing a circle. However, the significance of the circle shape in Elden Ring isn't quite as wholesome. The primary symbolic role of the circle is an unbroken boundary. The circle clearly divides what is inside of it from what is outside, dividing what is accepted from what is rejected. Consider the spell called Rejection, which draws a ring of runes around the caster before pushing away all that is without. The spell Law of Causality works in a similar way. The caster implies a circle with the motion of their hands, and once cast, a small circle appears around the caster that retaliates against anything that tries to attack, anything that tries to enter your sacred space. Miquella crafted several incantations that involve rings of light, which move out from the caster and then return, perhaps an expression of the relationship between causality and regression. Radagon responded with his own ring of light, a spell that represents the father's understanding of the Golden Order as opposed to the understanding of his gentler son. Radagon's Ring of Light makes a single, great ring which emanates from the caster and strikes everything else. This role of the circle as a division between what is inside and what is out connects to the role of circles in the Elden Ring itself, as most of the great runes have a circular shape, which divides those who are within the bounds of its rule of law and those who are outside of it. Indeed, this division between the in-group and out-group, those with grace and those without, is a major theme in Elden Ring's world. We see that those who live outside of grace are oppressed or forgotten, such as the wandering merchants, the misbegotten, or the Nox. We ourselves are called tarnished, because we are part of a group that were once exiled from the lands between, and have only returned now that grace has been extended to us once more, on a whim. Moreover, the Elden Ring shows a series of circles overlapping, which reflects the tendency of the Golden Order to assimilate disparate groups and graft them onto itself, in what you might call alloyed gold. At least, it tends to assimilate groups that are too strong to reject, such as the Carrion Sorcerers or the Ancient Dragons. Those who are both graceless and weak, however, have little recourse but to accept their station as outsiders. Radagon's willingness to embrace this feature of the Golden Order in an unnuanced fashion is expressed in his Ring of Light, for Radagon came to understand the Golden Order and its oppressive character deeply, yet still chose to defend it. Miquella was unable to accept the same truths, and so left to start a new order that could embrace all and bring them into the protection of one great circle, or rather, a circlet. Miquella's circlet says that his new order was to be based upon it, a single, simple, unified ring. This is what Miquella meant by unalloyed gold, not a series of compromises and half-measures, but a single great law that could apply to all. Unfortunately, the single great law he tried to base his order upon was a love that would be compelled by his charm. Miquella's order would indeed have been gentler than the Golden Order, but at the cost of an end to free will. Thus, we refuse to be embraced. One more note about rings. I've been using the words ring and circle interchangeably, but there is a reason why the word ring keeps getting used. If we were going to be a little more precise, the ring shape, or annulus, has thickness to it, while a circle does not. But more importantly, when you bring the shape of a circle into three-dimensional space, you would expect its 3D counterpart to be a sphere. But the ring shape we actually see is flat. It exists within a single plane. This will become significant in a minute. In the meantime, that's one shape down so far. Apparently, I can ramble, so buckle up. Maybe get some water, because we've got more to talk about. For contrast to the ring, let us consider the sacred shapes of a culture that predated the Golden Order, the most sacred shapes of the Hornsent, which were the spiral and the arc. The spiral is a shape hidden in plain sight in the base game, appearing on armor, in spells, and in the sacred relic sword wielded by the last boss. The DLC has doubled down on this imagery, explaining that it was a sacred symbol of the Hornsent, and even telling us in the Spira, or is it Spira, incantation, that it is the shape of a normalized crucible current, whatever that means. Interpreting the shape is hard, because not only is Elden Ring indirect in its storytelling, but the truth of the spiral was clearly hidden away in the realm of shadow. In a recent video, VatiVidya said that the spiral may represent causality, which I thought was interesting because I was thinking of the spiral as representing regression. I see now that it represents both, as I will explain in a moment. But first, let's consider the shape on its own terms. What is a spiral? Well, in 2 dimensions, a spiral is a curve that converges on a point. But that's not actually what most spirals look like in Elden Ring. Elden Ring's spirals are actually three-dimensional helixes. They are a shape that, unlike a ring, only exists in a three-dimensional context. In fact, you could say that the relationship between a ring and a spiral is dimensionality. Take the Law of Regression spell, for example. I previously said that the motion of the caster's hands are like the hands of a clock, but that's only if you consider the motion in 2 dimensions. What a Golden Order way of thinking about it, am I right? If you extend the same motion beyond the plane into 3-dimensional space, the motion of your 2 hands, moving around a central axis, becomes a double helix, or a spiral. And this is true of any helix. If you look at a 2-dimensional slice of the motion, it's a ring. But add another dimension and the spiral emerges. If we continue our pattern of interpreting Elden Ring's symbols in very literal fashion, then we might say that the Golden Order attempted to flatten reality by trying to create a perfect and eternal shape for the world. Radagon, in particular, was the staunchest and last standing defender of this order, and his own symbol is a grid shape, which we can see as his desperate attempt to hold the existing order together, to prevent change and maintain the status quo. Now, watch what happens when he dies, in the moment that his gridlock on reality is released. We see the rings of the Elden Ring inside his body, flat circles in a plane with the water. Then, as he passes away, the Elden Beast emerges, and draws out from Radagon's body a spiral. This is a direct representation of the relationship between the ring and the spiral, as new possibilities have been unlocked by Radagon's death, and change can once again come to the lands between, depending on which ending you choose. So, if the spiral is necessarily a shape that exists within movement, that gives us another way of understanding the ring shape as an unchanging cycle. If we bring Buddhism back off the shelf for a second, there's a very important concept here that connects not only to Elden Ring, but to all of the Souls games. The wheel of samsara, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. It is one of the primary goals of a Buddhist, and for the protagonist of every Souls game, to liberate themselves from this endless cycle. In the context of Elden Ring, the Golden Order is built upon an eternal cycle of rebirth, as the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring by Queen Marika. Thus, the dead are buried at the roots of the Erd Tree for their bodies and souls to be absorbed and reborn in the next generation. By contrast, the Spira incantation says that a spiral-shaped crucible current will one day reach to the heavens to transcend earthly existence. Notably, most of the spiral shapes in the game are specifically double helixes. The double helix is interesting for several reasons. First, as others have noted, it is the shape of DNA in our world. Thus, the fact that we see this shape connected to the Elden Beast and to the Crucible speaks to the role these forces have in the world of Elden Ring, as facilitators of transformation, of evolution. The evolutionary gifts of the Crucible are direct analogs to the mutations in our world that get passed to future generations by DNA and natural selection. The other interesting thing about a double helix is that it has 2 axes of motion for the bodies involved. There is the motion of the 2 bodies in relation to each other, swirling about each other without ever touching in an eternal dance. This is what we might call the pull between meanings, a representation of causality. Meanwhile, the 2 bodies together are moving along another axis, towards a destination, what you might call a shared pull towards a greater meaning. This is regression. And notably, the Spira incantation in particular, the sacred symbol of the Hornsent, moves upward, toward the sky, like their great tower, or like the trunks of the Shadow Tree. If all life originated as part of the One Great, in the void between the stars, then this motion is the ultimate expression of regression, of the yearning of all things to return to their origin. So why doesn't a crucible current finish this motion? Why doesn't a tree or a tower reach all the way to the stars? Because in every case, sooner or later, the shape is broken by an arc. The arc is another shape that appears repeatedly in the base game. It is the shape of the item we sacrifice to empower a great rune. It is the shape Marika hangs from within the Erd tree, and in turn, the shape of her own rune, which is found at the very top of the Elden Ring. But before we discuss its symbolic role, let's once again consider the shape on its own terms. Mathematically, an arc is a portion of a circle or curve. By its nature, it is incomplete, part of an implied greater whole. What I find more interesting is that an arc has asymmetry, a kind of directionality. It's hard to find the right language for this because arcs don't really have sides, but I'm going to refer to the inner curve and the outer curve of the arc, and to the direction of the outer curve as the direction that the arc is facing overall, because that's the direction that arc-shaped spells tend to move toward. So with that in mind, the interesting thing about arcs is that they present a very different symbology depending on the direction they're facing. The inner curve implies a gathering of energy and is the shape of open arms welcoming you in. The outer curve implies an emanation of energy or a repulsion, much like being on the outside of a circle. In order to interpret the relevance of arcs in Elden Ring, our first observation is that they are frequently depicted facing down. We see this in the rune arc item in the shape of Marika's arms as depicted in her churches, as well as in the starlight gathering basins and the unnamed tower in the realm of shadow. Some of these objects may seem unrelated at first, but consider the innate character of a downward-facing arc. From above, it looks like a basin, a place where energy from above can gather and coalesce. But from below, it has the character of a great weight looming overhead, or the underside of a celestial body. The game encourages us to consider one of these perspectives first, and then the other. The description of the rune arc item brings the basin metaphor directly to our attention, saying that the lower arc of the Elden Ring is said to be a basin in which blessings gather. These rune arcs are valuable objects that confer blessings upon us. But what about the upper arc in the Elden Ring, where Marika's rune sits? This is the shape of the crucifixes throughout the Land Between. And when we finally find Marika, she is herself crucified below a rune arc, revealing the other side of the same shape, that the weight of gathered blessings from above must be carried by whoever is below. Indeed, one analog for the shape of Marika's rune is a chalice. A chalice holds water, wine, or even sacred tears. But in this visual analogy, the stem, the weight-bearing part of the object, is where we find Marika herself. Marika is frequently referred to as a vessel for the Elden Ring. And considering my claim from the previous episode that Marika's godhood may be connected to the jarring ritual of the horn scent, there's a clear connection between the image of a container or basin and the shape of the rune arc visible inside her body. The more oppressive aspect of the arc shape is increasingly brought to our attention the further we get in the game. And in the DLC, we have the arc-shaped spells of the horn scent, which say in their descriptions that the arc resembles the barb, a known symbol of coercive questioning. This is a spell used by inquisitors, so the game wants us to draw a connection between the arc and the enforcement of orthodoxy. The outer curve of the arc emanates force or authority outward in an effort to impose a principle upon those on the receiving end. I said in my last video that great runes contain a rule or a principle for many people, and now we may start to see why we need a rune arc to activate one. You can look at it from either perspective. Blessings gather into the rune arc from above, and when we break it, those blessings pour into ourselves. Or, viewed the other way, we point the outer curve of the rune arc down at ourselves, and as the rule emanates, we become the agent for imposing that rule on the world around us. Either way, the same interpretation on a much grander scale becomes true of Marika, holding an arc shape above her head at the moment of her ascension. We could keep going with all the various arc shapes in the game, applying these visual principles to every arc we see, but I want to get to the even juicier part of this video, which is what happens when these shapes interact. So what happens when spirals, arcs, and circles interact? Let's consider the spiral and the arc first. We noted that the spiral has a natural character of movement, and seems connected to evolution and transformation. If the rising spiral in particular refers regressively back to the cosmos as the origin of all life, then the downward arc represents the continued emanation of celestial energy down to the lands between. Moreover, the shape of the arc at the top of a spiral shows the point where regression and causality meet. And let's look at Meteor for the clearest example of what this interaction represents. Meteor's tail, if you can call it that, is a double helix shape, and at the end there are two fingers holding an orb, explicitly called the microcosm. When Meteor casts, these two fingers spread apart and form an arc shape, and the microcosm comes alive, emanating with energy outward in a way that imitates, in miniature, the Big Bang. What I take from this is that the point where causality and regression meet refers to the moment of creation. The spiral unravels into the arc, and this division is synonymous with the act of creation. This connection between division and creation is echoed in the words of Shabriri, avatar of the frenzied flame, who seeks to undo creation. He begs us to destroy all that divides and distinguishes. With this context in mind, let's consider again the relevance of the double helix shape of the crucible as an analog to DNA. The double helix of our DNA contains our genetic memory, but in order to access that memory and create proteins, our DNA also needs to first divide and unravel. This unraveling motion is what gives rise to new life. But we're not done yet, because this lens also gives us a way to dissect much of the plant imagery in the game. Notably, the spiral shape is frequently connected to the crucible tree, which itself has two trunks that twist together. But at the top of a tree, it branches out to form leaves, flowers, and seeds. This painting in the round table hold directly juxtaposes Marika and the arc shape with the boughs of the Erd tree. And we also see a direct connection between the arc shape and seeds in the seed talismans of the DLC, where a seed can be seen nestled in the arc formed by a pair of fingers. So with seeds and flowers, spirals and arcs in mind, let's watch one of the most famous cutscenes from the game, Melania's second phase. Melania has been holding back the scarlet rot within her for her entire life, and this is the moment she finally embraces it. A great flower twists together in a spiral shape. This is the shape of transformative energy, and here it forms a chrysalis for her to change within. When the flower blooms, it unravels in an act of creation and deification. The arcs implied by this blossomed flower are the emanation of her divine aspect, the spread of her scarlet rot. To reinforce the connection of her spiral-shaped flower with metamorphosis, she emerges with wings and surrounded by butterflies. This cinematic has it all. Also note that this connection between the spiral and the unopened bud appears in the Church of the Bud in the Realm of Shadow, and may help to connect this church to the faith of the Hornsent. the church is specifically dedicated to buds, to flowers that have yet to blossom. And we get hints that the people of this church may have had a different relationship to rot than we see in Melania and Caelid. Perhaps the ritual of this church respected the spiral form and the transformative aspect of the bud, but sought to keep the divine energy of rot under control, to prevent it from blossoming and spreading wildly. I'll discuss this more in a later episode, but the fact that Melania's bud is spiral-shaped at least helps to draw a connection for a church that otherwise seems misplaced. I mentioned that the seed talismans depict fingers in an arc shape, and that the end of Metzer's tail, we find 2 fingers that open in an arc, and this gives us a hint about the nature of the 2 fingers. Why are they specifically 2 fingers? Well, it's because what they represent within this world is creation through division, through separation. They are agents of causality. We see in the Round Table Hold that when they are supposedly consulting the greater will, when their attention leaves and they are least active, the least present, their position is closed. Meanwhile, atop the divine towers, pairs of fingers appear dead or catatonic, and yet their position is partially open, and they are still able to function and impart a blessing simply by virtue of their shape. By contrast, the 3 fingers don't form any clear visual shape, because they communicate instead through touch. The 3rd finger is an opposable thumb, which allows them to grasp at the world. The 3 fingers are the most extreme, the most radical agents of regression in the game. So communing by actually reaching out and grabbing us is a fitting metaphor for removing the space between individuals, of undoing what divides and distinguishes. So I'd love to keep rambling about these shape interactions, but I do want to deliver on my promise from the beginning of this video to apply all of this to the Elden Ring. We've already discussed several of its aspects as we've gone along. Noticeably, the modern Elden Ring lacks any form of spiral shape, even though the spiral appears in the more ancient Elden Ring during the Age of Dragons. This tells us that transformative power is suppressed within the Golden Order, which makes sense because the Golden Order is an attempt to create a perfect and eternal, unchanging state for the world. We see that the upper and lower arc point in the same direction, down, and this is the direction in which Marika's divine energy pushes, toward the earth, keeping all living things grounded, literally trapped in the lands between. By contrast, consider that the Rune of Death is one of the rare examples of an upward-facing arc, drawing energy from the earthly realm and sending it up, one way of moving on from the world. We can also see that the overlapping circles in the center of the Elden Ring form what I earlier called alloyed gold, a mix of disparate ideas and people linked together and brought within grace. It also represents the set of laws that the Golden Order enforces on the world, which are in between the arc at the top, which represents Marika, the Godhead, and the arc at the bottom, which represents the emanation of her divine will outward to the lands between. In fact, if you look closely, there are more arcs within the Elden Ring's form, gradually growing as they emanate downward. But there is something else interesting that the game implies to us about the shape of the Elden Ring. Consider the Golden Order Greatsword. This sword belonged to Radagon, who took a gift from his wife and altered it to mirror the shape of the Elden Ring, or at least how Radagon sees the Elden Ring. We can see Marika's rune at the top, the handle and pommel of the sword. Then it connects directly to a ring, which is a principle to be enforced by the Order, and it ends in a blade. This item implies to us that, to Radagon's perspective, the shape of the Elden Ring is the shape of a sword. The DLC shows us an even clearer connection between the Elden Ring and a weapon. In order to find it, we have to go down, and then even further down, to the lowest area on the map, the Abyssal Woods. Here we find Midra's manse, and within, Midra himself, who is impaled upon a weapon of suppression and torment, placed there by the Horn-Sent Inquisitors to punish him for investigating the Flame of Frenzy. The game shows us this shot of Midra, with the golden barbs of a blade spreading out inside his body. We were told that golden arcs resemble barbs, and now we see just what was meant by that. The arcs spreading out within Midra's body amount to an extreme form of torture. But then there's this curious line in the description of this weapon's weapon art. It says that there's something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux. I couldn't quite make out what this meant until the next time I saw Marika, kneeling in a similar position at the end of the game, with the golden arcs of the Elden Ring visibly spreading out within her body. I think the game wants us to compare Midra to Marika, to see the golden arcs of the Elden Ring within her as a representation of torment. Perhaps this shouldn't surprise us, as we already know that her own rune at the top of the Elden Ring is a depiction of her crucifixion. With this context, there is at least one thing we can say for certain. Marika's godhood is directly tied to her trauma, just as Midra's rise as the Lord of Frenzied Flame is brought about directly by his own suffering. This is what is meant by saying that suffering is built into the very foundation of the Golden Order. It is woven into the shape of the Elden Ring itself. Before all this, I might have said that the Elden Ring looks like a cascading waterfall of blessings, with the gold in each basin overflowing and pouring down to the next. But now that we have discussed it, I can only see the Elden Ring as an expression of Marika's own suffering, magnified and imposed upon the world around her, the world below her. It is Marika's inability to transcend and escape her own human frailty that traps the rest of the world. And the only people more pitiable than Marika herself are those outside of grace, underneath the hovering blade of the Golden Order. Well, you all did it. You convinced me to make more Elden Ring content. Honestly, I wasn't sure what the reaction to my first video would be like, and I was blown away, not just by the engagement, but by the words of support and of constructive feedback that came pouring in. I genuinely couldn't ask for a better community to be part of. While we're here, I wanted to bring up something from comments that may serve as an opportunity to clarify how I'm thinking about my project. Several people mentioned Nameless Singer's video about the Erd Tree being a tree of memories, and I actually watched that video myself shortly after finishing recording the bulk of my first video. Nameless Singer focuses on the importance of memory and claims that runes are memories, whereas I say that runes are words. The thing is, these two views aren't actually contradictory. I also describe golden runes as a memory, specifically a memory of the expression of the language of creation. I don't think this is exactly what Nameless Singer means by memory, but the point is that these interpretations run parallel to each other, rather than being at odds. I think of our respective interpretations as lenses through which to view the lore, and depending on which pair of interpretive glasses you are wearing, you will notice different connections. It's a question of emphasis. That said, there are a few specific things I'm planning to address in my next video that may bridge some of the gap between these two parallel interpretations. This is a good moment to reflect on what I mean by an interpretation, and why I see my project as different from many others. While I do want my reading of Elden Ring to be correct, that's not really the part that matters to me. The metric I'm using when evaluating an idea to include in my videos is whether or not it adds something meaningful to my interpretation. If it gives us a conceptual tool or allows us to take away a new theme without contradicting anything in the game, that's a good starting point. There are other comments that had good questions or thoughts in them, and I might address some of these comments in shorts or in another format, but I do want to keep my flagship videos focused on progressing the core concepts of my theory. So, sorry to anyone who hasn't gotten a satisfying answer to their question yet, but I am reading comments and thinking about them. It may take me a minute to put out the next episode, but there is definitely more coming, and I am excited about some of the points that I've still yet to make. For now, thanks for watching, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.